Welcome to part 2 of our discussion regarding the psychology of personality. In this video, we're going to talk about some more perspectives on personality. And the first perspective we're going to take a look at, as you can see, is the humanistic perspective. And the humanistic perspective focuses on and talks about, well, the free will, self-awareness, and psychological growth of each individual human. Proceeding. So we just want to kind of talk about, we want to look at, what are the roles of self-concept? What is the actualizing tendency and unconditional positive regard play in Rogers' personality theory? So we will take a look at that as we proceed. Another question that we would like to talk about, I'd like for you to answer eventually, what are the key strengths and weaknesses of the humanistic perspective? So we'll take a look at that. So going forward. So first and foremost, we need to come up with kind of like a broad concept regarding humanistic psychology. So basically that theoretical viewpoint basically emphasizes, first, the inherent goodness of people. Second, human potential. Third, self-actualization. Fourth, the development of one's self-concept. And fifth, basically, what is healthy personality development? So let's go further and start answering some of these questions. Of course, I want to remind you at any point during this video, if you'd like to pause and take some notes or do some research, please feel free to do so. One of the key proponents of humanistic psychology was Carl Rogers. And so basically, Carl Rogers used the term actualizing tendencies. So basically, he said that is the basic human motive of all humans, is to have the tendency to actualize, to fulfill their potential, so to speak. And so basically, you can see here a more formal definition of actualizing tendency as the innate drive to maintain and enhance the human organism. Let's go further. So Carl Rogers also talked about and explored a set of perceptions and beliefs that you hold about yourself. So Carl Rogers was interested in the idea that people tend to be motivated by their self-concept. Basically, people say, hey, this is who I am. This is what I'm going to do in life. And that hence motivates their behavior. A little further talking about Carl Rogers. Said, well, he used the term conditional positive regard. And basically that's the sense you'll be valued and loved only if you behave in a way that is acceptable to others. And Rogers also said, well, what is unconditional positive regard? And that's the sense that you're going to be valued and loved even if you don't conform to the standards and expectations of others. So you're loved and accepted unconditionally. Let's go forward just a little bit. So we want to kind of get an overview in order to evaluate humanistic perspective on personality. So some of the strengths are, well, made some good major contributions to psychotherapy, counseling, education, and parenting. And some of the limitations, well, they are basically, once again, it's difficult to test or validate using the scientific method. these are, these things that I mentioned, according to Rogers, basically are broad conceptualizations. They're not based upon actual research procedures using the scientific method. And some have said, well, Rogers, his ideas tend to be a little too optimistic. And, we kind of, therefore, or henceforth, kind of minimize some of the more destructive aspects of human nature. So some things to think about and to consider. All right. Another perspective that we'd like to talk about in this session is cognitive perspective. So you remember cognitive means mental processes. So the social cognitive perspective stresses our thought processes, self-regulation, and the importance of situational influences. So we'll take a look at that a little bit further. So some of the questions I would like for you to try to answer once you've been able to pause the video and we've talked about this perspective. Here are some of the questions. Like, what is the basic principle of what's called reciprocal determination? The second question is, what is the role of self-efficacy beliefs in personality? And the third question to consider is, like, what are the key strengths and weaknesses of the social cognitive perspective? So going forward, we're going to answer these questions, and then would like for you to review those on your own time. So first and foremost, we need to get a working definition of what social cognitive perspective is. And that basically, that emphasizes the conscious, self-regulated behavior rather than unconscious mental influences and instinctual drives. So we can take that apart. So here we are tending to, in this perspective, the social cognitive perspective, basically says that, people, we're focusing more on they can make conscious choices and regulate their own behavior rather than being kind of under the influence of unconscious influences. Okay, and then taking it just a little further here, the social cognitive personality theorists, they said, they tend to use and rely upon experimental findings more so than some of the other perspectives that we talked about previously. So one theorist who was a major proponent of social cognitive theory was Albert Bandura. So basically, Bandura's theory of personality that emphasized the importance of observational learning. So he was a major proponent of the idea and concept that, we learn from observing the behavior of others. And second, as a result of observational behavior, we can engage in conscious cognitive processes. That way we can make up our own minds and decide upon our future behavior in order to, fulfill certain goals that we might have. And social cognitive theory also, takes a look at social experiences as well as, self-efficacy beliefs and reciprocal determinism. There's a term right there that we need to look at. So I did define that down below here. And reciprocal determinism is basically, that's a model, and it explains human functioning and personality and how they are caused by the interaction of behavioral, cognitive, and environmental factors. So very closely, related to the biopsychosocial model and how those are all interactive. And just thought you would appreciate being able to stop and pause the video and just kind of look at how the interaction between those three factors. Okay, so researchers have also said that the development of one's personality also kind of depends on one's sense of self-efficacy. And so basically the sense of self-efficacy is beliefs that people have about their ability to meet the demands of situations, specific situations, feeling self-confident about one's abilities. So of course we should evaluate, in the broader perspective, we should evaluate the strengths and weaknesses or limitations, so to speak, of this cognitive perspective, the social cognitive perspective on personality. So some of the strengths are, well, it's well grounded in empirical laboratory research, uses the scientific methods, so that is definitely a plus. Also, it has major impact on the study of personality, so it's very valuable and very efficacious approach to the study of personality. I'm not going to go through all these. Please pause the video and take your notes or study these on your own time. Okay, so we talked about some of the strengths, a couple of the strengths of this perspective, and now we're going to take a look at some of the limitations. So you might have remembered a little bit earlier I said, well, it's well grounded in empirical laboratory research. Well, some researchers have said, well, the laboratory experiences, they may be too simple, and they don't really necessarily reflect the complexity of human interactions in the real world. Since they are laboratory type environments, that might not reflect the human interactions out in the real world. Something to think about. And last but not least, another limitation we have to keep in mind with the social cognitive perspective is, well, things like the unconscious, the emotions, and our conflicts, well, they are actually not considered and kind of downplayed to a certain extent. So kind of comparing, like the psychoanalytic perspective and comparing that with the humanistic perspective. The psychoanalytic perspective was Sigmund Freud. You might remember from a previous video. And so Freud, was tended to be a little more pessimistic, and whereas Rogers, from the humanistic perspective, was, kind of viewed humans as a little more positive and forward-moving, constructive and realistic, and a little more trustworthy in pursuit of their own human potential. And Rogers, also from the humanistic perspective, posited that basically all humans, they tend to naturally gravitate, toward their own positive growth. And that benefits themselves and society. So it kind of goes without saying that it tends to be a little more positive, forward-moving, rather than pessimistic and focusing on human aggression, that kind of thing. And comparing Freud's psychoanalytic theory with Bandura's, well, Freud said, well, being aggressive, that's more universal. Humans tend to unconsciously be just more aggressive. Okay? And Bandura his answer to that was, well, I feel that, and I think that behavior is driven by more conscious goals and motives. So conscious is the key word there, whereas Freud is unconscious. Okay, this is just a very summarizing everything that we've talked about generally in respect to humanistic perspective. I know I've talked about this in depth, so I just want to provide you a little bit of a summarization in order for you to kind of review everything and kind of master these concepts. Okay, so we're going to move on to another perspective regarding personality, and that was what's called the trait perspective. So the main idea behind trait perspective is, well, they want to understand, researchers approaching it from this perspective, so to speak. Well, they want to look a little more in depth and gain more insight into the trait theories of personality. So identify, describe, and measuring the individual differences that might occur in so doing. So we will go a little bit further into this, gain a little more insight. Here are some of the key questions about the trait perspective. So what are traits? And how do surface traits and source traits differ? So we will answer that question together. Also, we want to take a look at what are the 3 influential trait theories, and how might heredity affect one's personality. And the last question we're going to look at is, what are the key strengths and weaknesses of the trait theories of personality? So first of all, we want to come up with some working definitions with these terms. So first of all, trait, well, that's a relatively stable, enduring disposition to behave in a certain way. Okay? So when we make a judgment on somebody, we're communicating about somebody, and we say, hey, this person is always very happy, very positive all the time, or, oh, this person's always very negative about everything. We're talking about their traits, personality traits. Okay. And then let's take that a little bit further, okay, and talk about another term, trait theory. So basically, the goal in pursuing trait theory is focusing on identifying, describing, and measuring individual differences in behavioral predispositions. And the trait theorists, as I put down below here on this slide, they tend to view a person as being a unique combination of personality characteristics or attributes called traits. Okay, so that's what's one of the key concepts to keep in mind when it comes to trait perspective. That it kind of goes without saying. I'm sure a lot of us, when we've experienced many people, and everybody's a little different. Everybody has slightly different traits. Okay, let's go a little further here. So we want to talk about what are surface traits and what are source traits. So surface traits, basically, the formal definition is characteristics or attributes that can be inferred from observable behavior. So surface traits, those are the things I mentioned a little bit earlier, like, hey, this person is very positive, Or this person is very negative. This person it tends to be happy often. This person tends to be more saddened or scared, that kind of thing. That is surface traits. It's observable behavior. But source traits basically, well, they basically are the fundamental dimensions of personality. So they are basic traits that are kind of hypothesized to be universal and relatively few in number. So basically, source traits are the fundamental dimensions of personality. So we need to talk about a few of the psychologists that were interested in trait theories. And the first of these was Raymond Cattell, and Hans Eysenck. So first of all, Raymond Cattell, he basically proposed 16 personality factors, and, attempted to come up with those 16 personality factors using a statistical technique, called factor analysis. All right. And so he developed what he called the 16 personality factor questionnaire. And keep in mind, as throughout the evolution of the development of the field of psychology, psychologists have said, well, it's not that those are invalid, so to speak, but 16 might be a little bit too much, too many traits for humans. Okay, so these are, real quick, I just provided a quick chart here of the 16 personality traits that Cattell offered here. All right. You don't have to memorize these, but, feel free to take a look at these and then kind of understand where was Cattell coming from and how do psychologists actually, tend to, how do they delve further into their field of interest? Okay, talking a little bit more about representative trait theories, and that is Hans Eysenck. And Hans Eysenck proposed similar model of universal source traits, but maybe with fewer though. And so basically, he basically proposed 3 different source traits, which were called introversion and extroversion, neuroticism or emotional stability, as well as psychoticism. And what is unique about Hans and his ideas were that basically Hans actually, approached everything, from many perspectives, but focused and said, well, individual differences in personality, they tend to be due to, biological differences among people. So this is just another chart that I wanted to include for you here about Eysenck's theory of personality types. And you can just see on the left-hand side of this diagram right here, this is introverted personality types. And then on the right-hand side, this is extroverted. So these can be, kind of viewed, conceptualized as being as part of a spectrum, so to speak. So when it comes to the 2 previous psychologists that we talked about, remember we said, one of the psychologists proposed that 16 personality factors. And the next said, no, I think there's really only 3 we should be concerned with. And, 16 can be too many and 3 can be too few, according to McRae and Costa. And so they actually posited what's called the 5-factor model. And so those 5 factors here are openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And so we can just kind of use the acronym, the term OCEAN, to help us remember the 5 factors. And that is the 5-factor model. And that is still considered to be a very useful construct currently in psychology. So we can see this, how I remember a little bit earlier I said, hey, we can view a lot of these factors in regard to a spectrum. And so we can kind of see this, you know, this is moving, this is the low end, and this is the high end of the spectrum. And there can be many, many different variations in between. Okay, so when it comes to talking about personality traits and everything, remember we want to approach everything that we are going to talk about in psychology from the bio-psychosocial perspectives. And so in regard to biological perspective, well, we need to talk about genetics and so behavioral genetics, so especially in regard to personality. So basically we want to study behavioral genetics studies the effects of genes and heredity or genetic heredity on behavior. And some examples here I'd just like to give very briefly, you know, evidence for genetic influence, things like inheriting a sense of extroversion or neuroticism, things like that. So a child may inherit that from their family, from their parents or their family, so to speak. Another way of looking at what we've been talking about the big 5 personality traits that we were talking about earlier, is neuroscientists, they have engaged in brain imaging, MRI scans. And so basically they found that people who were highly extroverted, they tended to show higher levels of brain activation in response to positive images. Further, they found in these brain scans that people who score high in neuroticism, well, they tended to show a little more activation in response to negative images. So there is a biological perspective to keep in mind. Okay, so once again, at the end of each module here, we tend to evaluate the trait perspective on personality more specifically in regard to this. So the strengths of trait perspective, well, psychologists, they generally agree that people can be described and compared in terms of basic personality traits. Now, some of the limitations, though, well, human personality, since everybody is so different and they have different stories and reasons why they behave the way they do, they said, well, some psychologists have argued, well, human personality, we can't really explain it, really. It can't, because once we write about one person, that's only a case study. And so, something to keep in mind. So here are the major personality perspectives here. I summarized all these on this chart here for you. Okay. Please pause the video and study it for a bit. Take some notes if you want to, if you feel so motivated. And briefly, we are going to move on to the idea like, hey, first of all, how do psychologists test, how do they test for personalities? And we've, may have heard of tests, personality tests, so to speak. And even employers might actually use some of these tests, in the hiring process, that kind of thing. And so basically we have to keep in mind, those tests, they measure and evaluate individuals' personalities basically in two different ways. They either use a projective test or a self-report inventory. And we're going to take a look at a little of those a little more in depth as we go. So what is a projective test? Well, that's a personality test, basically designed, and to let a person respond to ambiguous stimuli. Okay, so that way, if they are responding to ambiguous stimuli, they might reveal some hidden emotions and internal conflicts projected by the person into the test. So I would like to give you an example. So like the Rorschach test, okay? So this is an example of a certain type of test that and each individual will interpret this differently and see something differently according to what some psychologists say, what they may be projecting from inside their individual personality traits, so to speak. Okay, the other type of test when it comes to personality is what's known as the self-report inventory. And basically that's the kind of test basically in which a person fills out a survey or a questionnaire either on their own or with the help of an investigator. So self-report inventories, they often ask, real direct questions about their interests, a person's values, maybe symptoms they are dealing with, certain behavioral traits, that kinds of things. Okay. So some of the key questions that we want to answer in this process talking about personality assessment. The first question is what are the most widely used personality tests? Well, we've already briefly talked about those. The second question is, what are some of the key strengths and weaknesses on projective tests and self-report inventories? How do they compare to each other? Okay, so as a brief reminder, psychological tests, they assess a person's abilities, their aptitudes, their interests, or personality on the basis of a systematically obtained sample of behavior. So, although, each person is different and has a different story and everything, but psychologists, they say, that psychological tests in general is useful insofar as it achieves two basic goals. And those two basic goals are, well, does the test accurately and consistently reflect a person's characteristics on some dimension being studied for? And the second basic goal of the test is, well, does it predict a person's future psychological functioning or behavior? This is just a gentle reminder here, a summarization of the two types of tests, projective test and we already talked about the Rorschach test, okay, and the projective test here. Okay, so a type of projective test is what's known as the thematic apperception test. And basically that's a personality test that involves a person creating a story about the ambiguous scene. So that's kind of like the Rorschach, but maybe a scene of certain, a group of people engaging in a certain type of behavior and they want to ask their client, hey, what is your story when you see this? What are you seeing them doing? How are these, how does this make you feel? Etc., etc. Okay, so when it comes to some of the strengths and limitations of these projective tests, well, some of the strengths, might include, the information obtained from the test, might help facilitate psychotherapeutic processes. But some of the limitations might include, it's highly subjective scoring. So what that means is each individual, because of their different unique story and their unique cognitive processes, the scoring might mean something that's just really unique to them, and it's hard to generalize. And here's I just thought I would include some samples. Here are some examples of maybe some different types of personality inventory tests. So we need to talk about, since we've been talking about self-report inventories, what are some of the strengths and weaknesses? Well, some of the strengths are, standardization, meaning that the same procedure is employed every time under the same type of circumstances. And weaknesses, though, you can see here I put deliberate deception, so the individual that might be taking the test, they might just deliberately be answering in a deceptive manner because they don't want to share their deepest, darkest secrets, so to speak. Just some terms I want to make you aware of. Possible selves basically just refers to very unique, highly personalized, futuristic images of oneself. So that's basically when an individual says, "Hey, I see myself doing this in the future. This is how I'm going to live. This is where I'm going to do for my career, and this is what my type of family I see myself being." So that is possible self. Okay, everyone, so that concludes our discussion about psychological perspectives on personality. Thank you for sharing your time, and we'll catch you on the next video.